Hey you guys, I wanted to take a few minutes to give an overview of the responsive smokes asset that I developed for Unity URP. This asset is only compatible with Unity URP. Um, it allows you to easily render volumetric smoke, like smoke grenades, in your project. Um, I'll just go ahead and generate it really quick. You can see that it's generating. And it's generating really slow because we're just in edit mode right now. So we're gonna jump into play mode really quick to show that it can generate faster. You can also see that it's kind of boring, and we'll fix that too. So you can see that it generated pretty quickly there. There's an option to regenerate it so that when you're testing out your smoke, you can customize it pretty easily. You can see that when it finished, it automatically disabled itself. I'm just gonna re-enable it and then change the cleanup options to none. And I'm gonna bring it over here into our scene. So the smoke is designed to make it easy for you as a developer creating a game like an FPS, for example, to create gameplay impacting volumetric smokes for Unity. There's a lot of options here. We'll go through some of them. But at a high level, what happens when we generate the smoke is that it looks around at the nearby scene geometry and it automatically adapts the shape of the smoke to fit the nearby scene geometry. So for example, if we generate it really close to this wall, it'll generate around the wall instead of going into the wall. So the first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to add a noise effect to the smoke. I'm going to set this to none as well. So when you generate the smoke, you can see that it's eroding using this noise texture. So if we change the erosion scale to 0, we can now see the overall voxel structure that we use to generate this smoke. You can see that it just generated pretty quickly. And you can see that each one of these boxes sort of represents a voxel within a voxel grid that's represented by this cube. So when we click regenerate, the algorithm does a series of raycasts to decide which voxels should or should not have smoke in them. And then after constructing the voxel structure, it transforms that voxel structure into a signed distance field structure. And once it's in that signed distance field structure, we pass that data to the GPU, and we can use that information on the GPU to tell a shader that's rendering on this box, tell that shader how to render and what to render. So that happens every single frame. So for each of these frames as it's generating, it passes the SDF structure, signed distance field structure, to the GPU. So when the erosion scale is set to 0, it's super obvious what the sort of voxel structure looks like. And that is by design. So you can have, first of all, it can be easier to sort of test out the settings and make sure that it's working correctly. And second of all, it's so that you can have sort of low poly or voxel style volumetric smoke in your project. So now we're gonna take the erosion scale up just a little bit. So we'll set it to 0.1. This way you can see the erosion happening while we're still able to see the sort of overall voxel structure. So you can, basically what's happening here is we're rendering through this box using ray marching. You are able to configure the maximum number of steps that you will conduct on this ray march. If it's set very low, you'll see that the result becomes quite noisy. However, it will be more performant that way. If you set it quite high, the result becomes much less noisy, but obviously the performance is worse as well. So we'll just leave it at this middle setting of 64. Now looking at the noise texture, the erosion scale, the wind, and the scale, what's basically happening is we're using the signed distance field information to determine how far into the voxel structure we should erode using this noise texture. And so when we increase the erosion scale, we're saying that we want to erode deeper in to the signed distance field using this noise texture. And so an option like 1 really helps you to get rid of the sort of apparent voxel structure. And so that's the recommended setting for sort of default use. But you can, of course, erode it further or erode it less. You can also control the wind speed. The wind speed controls the rate at which this noise texture will tile and move across this sphere. So you can imagine that this 3D texture here, which should show up. Let's see, maybe we can get the SDF to show up. There we go. So you can imagine that this is sort of panning across this sphere, and we're showing the result of that panning. You can tile it in any direction you want. So if you want it to move down, you can make it move down, up, or to the side, or even not at all. Okay. So I obviously suggest having some motion. I think it looks a lot nicer, but you can use your judgment. Now the scale controls the rate at which this texture repeats over the domain of this box. So if you set the scale to something quite high, the texture will repeat more frequently, causing more frequent changes in the noise shape of this smoke. If you set the scale to something quite low, then you'll see that the shape becomes more uniform, which can look good, and it really depends on what you want for your game. I think an option of 2, 3, or 4 looks the best for most use cases. One interesting option is setting it quite low. You'll see that it kind of becomes a little wibbly wobbly, which I think is really cool. So those are the noise options. So this interactive smoke, I'm just going to jump in quickly into this demo scene. You can see that we have this smoke here. It's actually interactable in the same way that the responsive smokes in CS2, for example, are interactable. So when we shoot with this gun, you can see that we spawn 2 new interactive projectiles. It's just because how many we shot. And if we shoot into the sphere, it creates a sort of eroded hole in that sphere. I think that's super cool. This also works even if you're inside of the sphere. And it also works with frag grenades. So that one didn't really go where I wanted it to. Yeah, so you can see that that smoke is eroded by that frag grenade, and it'll automatically come back as well after the frag grenade expires. So the frag grenade is controlled using this prefab, an interactive explosion prefab, and you can see that it fades in over 1/5 of a second, fades out over 1 second, and is active for 5 seconds with a radius of 3 units. So that's super cool. You can throw a grenade, have it erode the smoke, shoot through the smoke. Yeah. The projectiles have similar options. They also have a radius that controls the size of the hole that will be eroded. So you can shoot like super huge tank guns or something like that. I don't know. Or if you wanted, you could make it really small. Might be hard to see, but you can make it small and just kind of shoot these little tiny holes. Now, one thing to know is that for performance considerations, I do currently restrict the total number of explosions and the total number of projectiles that can affect a single smoke at a particular time. So right now that option is set to 10, meaning that as many as 10 projectiles can affect the smoke at once, and as many as 3 explosions can affect the smoke at once. We're just gonna jump out here, jump back into the scene view. So you can also configure the maximum density of the smoke. When the smoke spawns in, it automatically fades in from 0 density to the maximum density. And after the active lifetime, it automatically fades out from the maximum density to 0 density. If I click here, you can kind of see it fading in. Let me increase the fade in duration so that you can see it a little better. There you go. And if I make it really long, you'll see that it takes forever to fade in. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the way that we generate this and the way that we render this is using physically based algorithms. So the way that the density affects the visibility through the smoke is nonlinear. So just food for thought, something to keep in mind. Taking a quick look at the SDF quality option. So we'll just kind of actually go through these options now and explain what each section does. So the performance section controls most of the primary performance impacting options. The SDF quality controls the resolution of the voxel grid. A low quality will cause the smoke to be rendered at a lower resolution, and a high quality will cause the smoke to be rendered at a higher resolution. In general, a medium setting is fine for most applications. It's fairly dense, but you know, just use what you want. Just be aware it'll affect your performance. Now, the next option is the maximum frame cost in milliseconds. So generating this voxel grid, converting it to an SDF, and sort of making that data available to the GPU is or can be fairly performance intensive. And so I made it an option the extent to which this affects your game's performance. Using this option, the volume generator will continuously monitor the amount of time that it's taken in this particular frame. And if it exceeds this amount of milliseconds, it'll discontinue generating and pick up in the next frame. What this means is that the smoke generation can be inconsistent from frame to frame if you have a low option for this setting. So if you set it to something super small, like 1/100th of a millisecond, it may not generate over the same period of time every time in the same place. So that's something to keep in mind. You can set it to a high value so that it is not bounding your volume generation speed. Just be aware that, you know, if you do set it to something high and your user has a potato, then their computer might freeze. That's not right. There we go. So the maximum density, like I mentioned, controls the density of the smoke. You can control this during runtime. You can see it kind of jumps in here once we get to a certain level. It's because of this minimum visibility option, or actually it's not. But the minimum visibility basically says that once it reaches a certain sort of alpha value, then we clip to 0. So this can help you with making sure that your game is consistent. For example, you might want the game to like consistently not render people or characters if the visibility is below 0.05. So you would set the minimum visibility to 0.05. You could also set it to something higher, like 0.5, or if something is 50% occluded, then you floor the alpha to 0 and it completely hides the object. But just be aware that you might not always want to do that. This can improve performance though. I'm just gonna set this back to something like that and set this to something like that. So we're gonna bring up the erosion scale again. I'm gonna show a comparison between some of the different noise textures. So I've included 3 different Perlin noise textures. It's basically the same texture at 3 different resolutions. Okay, so you can see at 64 pixels, it really becomes quite detailed. And same thing with Worley noise, which is a bit more bubbly. Okay. You can control the main light tint, the ambient color tint, and the albedo of the smoke. So the main light tint, basically the smoke, we cast a ray through the scene, and then for each pixel where it's intersecting with the smoke, we sample to see how lit it is. And so depending on how lit it is, it'll be more or less affected by the main light color. So you can see if we bring this up, you can see that sections of the smoke are quite red and other sections are quite blue. Now I'll go ahead and change the ambient light color to something super dark blue so you can really see this effect in action. Now the areas that are very blue are being lit only by the ambient lighting. In contrast, the areas that are quite red are being lit primarily by the main lighting, but also by the ambient lighting. So it's not an either or. In other words, the ambient lighting is affecting the entirety of the smoke, and the main lighting is affecting areas of the smoke that are lit. You can control the lighting options by configuring the shadow step count, which controls how many steps we take to determine the lighting amount for this smoke. So bringing this down, you can see that the ambient lighting section basically goes away. In other words, we're having a harder time determining like that the smoke is dark over there. I'm gonna bring this up a little bit and then regenerate it so we get more of a spherical shape. You can see it's a bit easier when it's this big sphere. When we have the shadow step count quite high, we can see that the smoke becomes quite a bit better at determining dark areas. You can also control the shadow step size. So this controls how far each one of the shadow steps travels in order to determine that it's shaded or not. You can see some weird spots like over here. But if you look, you can see it's kind of lit by the sun. And so it's actually working perfectly. I think a setting of around 0.3 here works really well. I think a shadow step count of 2, 3 works well. Once you get to 4, it starts to become a little bit performance intensive, and 1, it's kind of boring. Now bringing the ambient light, let's just say that it's black. Now you can control the directional light color however you want. It automatically uses the directional light color. So if I click on this and I change the directional light color to like super bright green and bring the intensity way up, you'll see that it automatically responds to that. So this is sort of a combination of the main light color and the mask that you're using, this tint. Now the albedo affects how the smoke responds to the ambient and main lighting. So you can see here that the main lighting is mostly white. You can see here that the main lighting is mostly white. If we change the albedo to something like red, now the smoke is being tinted red. The smoke color is red. And so when the white light of the sun is hitting that smoke, it's causing the smoke to appear red. So it's as if the smoke is like a red piece of paper, right? Ooh, that should be living a little bit longer. Now, you can customize the albedo to whatever you want. This also affects the ambient light color as well. So you can see here that that the ambient light color, when set to white, will affect the color as well. I think that an albedo of white or almost white looks quite good. Maybe something like a little bit yellow or a little bit blue looks fine. And then you can always tint the ambient color to make it a little bit darker. And you might want to make the main light a little bit brighter. So we'll do 1 here and then like that. Now the target fill percentage, these generation options affect how the smoke sort of expands and generates. When you click regenerate, it's using this information to decide how it wants to fill this shape. The first thing that we'll look at is the target fill percentage. So if we set this to 1, the smoke will attempt to fill this entire voxel structure. Now, obviously, you probably don't want that because now it's like a big box. But you might want something that looks kind of more like this and is a little bit more full than the default setting, which is 0.2. Obviously, as you get to higher and higher values, it'll become more and more obvious that it's in this box shape. So keep that in mind. You can also configure the expansion update frequency. This basically controls the rate at which the smoke attempts to expand. So if you set this to what we've set it to here, 0.0167 or 1/60th, it'll attempt to expand 60 times per second. Now, if you set it to something smaller, like 1, it basically looks at the expansion duration and tries to determine sort of how many steps it needs to take to fully expand. And so here the update frequency of 1 means that we're only doing 1 expansion step during this expansion duration phase. Now, if we set this to something higher, like 5, you can see that it takes a few seconds for it to actually fill out. So the expansion update frequency is sort of bounded on the upper end by the expansion duration. Now, if we set this something small again, you can see it still takes quite a while to expand, almost at 5 seconds, but it's expanding somewhat more rapidly, sort of with smaller steps. So it sort of allows you to control how many steps happen within the expansion duration. If you set it to like 5, for example, it'll just spawn immediately. Okay. So you can see here what happens when you set the expansion duration quite high and the expansion update frequency to something like 1. So I think nice value is something like, 1. That way you can actually see the smoke growing, and a frequency is something smaller than that, maybe like 1/120th or something. You can also control the time over which the smoke fades in and the time over which the smoke fades out. Yeah. And there it goes. And then you can also control the cleanup options and startup options. So if you want, you can have the smoke destroy itself automatically, disable itself automatically, or do nothing when it's done. And for the startup options, when you enable the smoke, you can have it automatically smokeify or do nothing and wait for an API call. So those are the smoke options. Those were the explosion and projectile options. And that's pretty much it. So this is the responsive smoke asset. It's kind of a long video. So I hope that if you watched the whole thing, it was quite informative. Oh yeah. And in the explosion and projectile and smoke scripts, there are public methods that let you initiate the smoke, projectile, and explosion action. So for example, in the projectile script, you would go here and you would call the shoot method. So when you call shoot, any nearby volumetric smokes will be notified. The other thing to know is the smoke needs to be set onto a particular layer, a smoke layer, and the projectile needs to reference that layer, as well as the explosion needs to reference that layer, so that it can correctly identify the smoke and then notify that smoke when it interacts with it. So the projectile has a shoot function, the explosion has the explode function, and the smoke has the smoke function. Yep, so that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or if you're interested in further demos, just let me know and I'm happy to do a little bit of a showcase. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you're able to buy the asset and that it serves your game well. Thanks for watching.